Good evening and welcome to Law Talk, the show that brings the law, the events of the day, and the Constitution to you. We've been on a little bit because of COVID, but we're back. Mark, what are we covering tonight?
Good evening, Jen. Well, it's good to have the show going. We've had some little adaptation to do because of the whole shutdown and one thing and another on the Zoom, but we're up and running. And what we're going to start off with today is something that's fairly new, and it's called a Subchapter 5, a Roman numeral 5 bankruptcy. And it's a subset of a Chapter 11, which is what a business does when it needs to reorganize for financial reasons. So we're going to do that for our first segment. And then in the second segment, we're going to talk about a Supreme Court case. But let's start right in about Subchapter 5.
All right. Well, I understand the Chapter 11, just so you know, I just finished being on a committee for a large tech company as they reorganize under Chapter 11. And I will tell you, a large company reorganizing under a Chapter 11 is a complex organizational feat. So, Mark, I can tell you this. After residing on a committee for nearly a year, I will tell you, a committee is a hindrance to a Chapter 11.
Well,
so tell me why the Chapter 5 is better.
Well, it's a Subchapter 5, but I say it depends on whose side you're on. If you're a debtor, you like that committee, because the committee can kind of torpedo the plan. So, or one guy on the committee can object, and then your plan doesn't go through. Well, you can go to the cram down, but then you're going into a lot of litigation. So what happens with this Subchapter 5, and it started to be implemented on February 22nd and 2020. So it's fairly recent. And it was if you're doing less than $2.7 million worth of forgiveness or debt that you want to forgive, that was originally what it was. And then just in October, there was the CARES Act, and then they bumped that up to 7.5 million. So that only lasts till next March. So I would say if you're thinking of going bankrupt, you might consider doing it pretty dang soon.
Hey, Mark, can you explain why they only did it on a short term like that? I mean, why would they push it all into less than a year?
Well, I think that the reason they upped from the 2.7 to the 7.5 was because they because just kind of the emergency because of all the shutdowns. And I think it's like everything else. I mean, there's a lot of theories about the whole, whatever you want to call it, COVID-19. But when they're telling people how long they're going to be shut down, they like to tell them it's going to be 3 weeks. Well, it's going to be another month. And I think if they said, well, we're extending this for 10 more years because of COVID-19, people would freak out. So, there's kind of, they're letting this out in drips and drabs. So that's my theory. I think it's kind of political. There's no real reason you wouldn't do it that way. But who knows what's really going to happen. But also, I think what the reason they were able to push it up from 2.7 to 7.5 was because of the emergency, right?
Yeah.
And the emergency emergencies actually do go on forever, often when you pass a law. But, they have to pretend they'll go away soon. No, they can't really.
Well, it depends what the political winds are asking for, Mark.
Yeah, right.
We don't want to get too far into that. Why don't you tell me some more about the Subchapter 5 and what are the benefits for the small company, because this is small company stuff, for going through a reorganization under that?
Okay, so, mainly I think right now what you're going to see is like a lot of restaurants and bars, and they're really having, spas, any place, that has person-to-person contact, they're in a lot of trouble. And, I think a lot of them could make it for the first couple months. A lot of them are just, whatever, paying their triple net, or they've worked out some kind of deal with the landlord. They're getting some kind of reduction in the rent. But you got to understand, even a small restaurant, say San Francisco, is paying $20,000 a month in rent, maybe $30,000 a month. And if you're just doing takeout, depends on your structure, but I would say the places that were designed more for takeout are doing okay, right? But the places that were more like, we're going to be a sit down, people are going to buy some drinks and we're going to make our money on the drinks, these guys are in a lot of trouble. And so I think you see that's going to come to a certain point. where
Well,
they're going to have
okay,
to
let me ask that then. Is under the say you had landlords and tenants doing deals of restaurants, which as restaurant tenants, is there going to be any restriction on whether or not any interim agreements they sign might be enforceable even under a reorganization?
Well, that's an interesting question. I don't really know the answer to that, and I think there's going to be a lot of that. But I think, I guess the way I would look is kind of buyer beware. You know, people are going to keep the deal as long as they have to, and then when it's to their advantage to, I mean, if they've got federal protection, any deal they made in a state court, you know, in a state contract is going to be superseded. So I think that the bankruptcy would supersede that. But I mean, you got to look at it from the landlord's point of view too. I mean, they've got someone in there, right? And even if they're only paying a percentage of the rent, it's better than having no one in there paying no rent. So, I mean, there's a balancing act that a judge would look at on that one too.
Yeah, well, see, that's the whole thing, because you know how they have the anti-eviction laws going on.
Right.
I'm not even sure what's really enforceable or not enforceable with those. I know though, every court system that I'm dealing with has been hindered dramatically because they've had to lay off staff. So the idea that a landlord can even get anything out of an eviction is questionable. So then you throw in the Chapter 11 or the Subchapter 5 in this case. I have this really ominous thought that a lot of landlords are going to be taken to the bank because of the largesse of the government telling them they have to eat it.
Well, that's in the big picture. I just don't, you know, as far as the, you know, the macroeconomics of this, I think, you know, what you really are, we're in a struggle. I mean, if you look at the macro, I say we're in a struggle with China, but that's for a separate show.
Right.
You know, I mean, that's not for this show. This show is for if you're a small business and you thought, okay, I can hang together for 2 months or 3 months, and you kind of made your business plan adjustment around that. Now we're at the 8th or 9th month, and you're going, uh-oh, you know, what am I going to do? I would say Subchapter 5 may be the way to go, because otherwise, you know, your landlord at a certain point is going to lose his patience.
Well, Mark, let me ask a question. Why don't you take us through like from the start and then walk us through how that process really looks?
Okay, well, okay, so let's say that first of all, you've got to describe what your business does and how they do it. And, you know, so you want to have, you know, so you got to describe your business. And the idea of that is like, if the trustee is going to go, okay, I'm going to grant this Chapter 5, he wants to be sure that you're going to make your payments after the plan gets in there, right? Now, this is not as strict as a Chapter 11 plan. You know, Chapter 11 plan is got to be pretty much, you know, pretty complex and pretty much saying this is how it's going to work. The Chapter 5 is a little more lenient, but still the basic principle is that you're supposed to make your obligations that you set on your plan.
But not 100% of your obligations, right?
Well, no, but that are in the plan. The plan is going to cram down a lot of people. A lot of people are going to get stuck, right? They're going to be out of the money. But once you agree, I'm going to pay this dime on the dollar or 15 cents on the dollar, and I'm going to pay these off, and this is how I'm going to be profitable and pay my employees and move forward. That you have to explain that, right? So how are you going to move forward after you get the relief, right? Because you don't want to get the relief and then 6 months later you need the relief again, right? Yeah, it's just like, I mean,
well, there's still going to be restrictions on you file once, you're kind of stuck for so many years.
Well, I know, but I mean, they don't want to see you going belly up because you had a over optimistic plan. Okay.
Right.
And then if it looks like, you know, that plan isn't feasible, well, then it's not a real plan, right? You're not going to make it. So you're not going to get approved.
Well, you know, we have a wild card right now because we don't know how long COVID's going and how people are going to be able to meet the obligations of a plan. It's almost like we should wait till COVID's sort of over before you commit to how you're going to pay back the various creditors under a plan.
Well, COVID's going to be over in 3 weeks, right? I mean,
That's what they told us in March of
Yeah, March.
2020.
Yeah, it was what they said in March. So yeah, that's kind of an unknown. But you're what I'm trying to is kind of look at the difference between a subchapter 5 and 11.
Okay, so tell us the next step. What's the next
Okay,
step?
so but one of the biggest difference is that in 11 is that if you're the owner of this business, you may no longer be the owner of the business as part of the plan. Subchapter 5 tries to keep the owner of business staying to be the owner of the business. Okay. And then also, as in any bankruptcy or any priorities, the priorities aren't as strict as under 11. In other words, there's you have the least rights if you're insider, and the most rights you're the furthest away of investors. That ladder of priority is not as strict under the subchapter 5 because you're talking about smaller businesses and there's more probably family and friends kind of thing there. So they're a little more lenient on that, and that makes it so you don't file your And one of the things they didn't like, but what you were talking about, you can't do another one. But what if you do a chapter 11 and then you have to do a chapter 7?
Oh, I mean, convert it to a 7 because there's no way you can meet.
Not going to make it, right? And so what they're trying to do is like, instead of doing an 11 and being very harsh, and then he has to convert to a 7, let's try to make this subchapter 5 looking that, yeah, it's not the perfect plan, but and maybe we'll have to give it more time, and maybe it's kind of a bigger cram down, but he's going to survive. So I think that's.
So is this subchapter 5 then is trying to look out for the small business owners,
right,
other than looking out just for the creditors?
Well, I think the creditors are in bad situation either way, particularly unsecured.
Yeah, of course.
I mean, if you're unsecured, you got a real problem, no matter how it goes.
Yeah.
If you're secured, I think that yes, someone does 11, then they later do a 7, you got a real problem. You're probably better off they do a subchapter 5.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
and you hope that the person
is where the balance is.
Overly optimistic, but is actually predicting properly.
Right.
On their ability to repay.
And also, I think what it's going is that they want to set it up so people aren't as resistant, because it's probably a good decision, business decision at a certain point to do a bankruptcy. And the chapter 11 kind of pushes people off because it's so complex. And
well, chapter 11s, as you know and I know, are usually for people that have a lot of assets, they have a lot of debt, and so they're going to take the assets they have. It's not like a 7 where you have very little assets, but you have a lot of debt. And their 11, the one I was just working on, there was actually millions and millions and millions in incoming revenue, but their debt load was 5 times that. So right. You did have assets, and it looked like even completely unsecured creditors were going to get a little piece of the pie. And what's interesting about that is that's why the 11 reorganization is a commitment by the debtor to make somebody partially whole that originally that had extended a large amount of credit, but you're not just wiping them out like a chapter 7. Right. Now the subchapter 5 still looking out for you, but I can see that it's such a hybrid between the 7 and the 11. Does that make sense in that?
Well, what I think they see is there's a lot more bankruptcies coming as a result of the shutdowns, and they're hiring quite a few more trustees. I think 50 more trustees, or quite a few more. So they're saying there's going to be a flood of bankruptcies, and so let's make them so we can manage them. I think that's what this is about.
Okay.